May I come back to order? I apologize for the delay on that one. We should not have votes again until 4:30 or so. But that'll be in the middle of the time period that we'll have our FDA witness, though. We'll still have her on the stand at least till 10, I would assume, tonight. Thanks for the delay on that. I'd like to recognize Dr. Gosar for the next line of questions. Dr. Gosar.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hastings, how much would you say the typical biopharmaceutical company spends annually on drug research and development?
It depends on the size of the company, but an innovative company, our company has 90 employees, roughly $55 to $60 million a year. You could spend companies with 400, 500 employees with multiple drugs in the clinic, you could spend $1 billion a year in R&D.
And has that gone up over the years?
Yes.
And what are driving those factors of raising those costs, R&D costs?
So in certain instances, it's what trial designs have turned into, the numbers of patients one needs to go into clinical trials, the amount of time it takes to file an IND and get your first patient treated on a therapy, to enrolling patients in phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, not only in the U.S. but also globally. So it's a very large undertaking to do even randomized phase 2 clinical trials today. I call the randomized phase 2 clinical trials today the old randomized phase 3 trials of the past. They're roughly the same size as phase 3s used to be.
Gotcha. Mr. Huber, in his written remarks, Mr. Hastings cites a 2012 Manhattan Institute study that found that as much as 90% of the development costs for many drugs approved by the FDA are incurred during phase 3 clinical trials. Are you aware of this study?
I do distantly remember seeing it, but those numbers are not of my origin. I cannot speak further about them.
So what would be your thoughts on those findings?
Clinical trials and certainly the time value of money are a very large component of the cost of getting a drug to market. I could not be any more specific than that.
Gotcha. I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Hubner. How would you define a good clinical trial?
A good clinical trial is one that, if the drug is good, ends up with enough guidance on prescription protocols that future doctors can, with high confidence, prescribe the drug in ways that are likely to do more good than harm. Likewise, I might add one that rejects drugs that aren't going to be able to meet that criterion.
Yeah, so do you think that randomized controlled trials are out of date?
Well, I do. Yes, I think they are. Yes is the answer. I mean, there are some exceptions to every general statement, but yes, they are not making full use of the tools we should be using.
And so, what steps would you use to update those?
Well, the President Obama's Council of Scientific Advisors on Science and Technology issued a report last year that I cite in my written testimony. It's a pretty good starting point. I think things should go further. Others will be testifying before you today saying they're already gone further, and if they are, terrific, and the faster they move, the better. I do know that we should have been heading down this road a decade ago, and there were high officials, excellent qualifications, who I greatly admire, who were sketching out what needs to be done to develop multidimensional data on how drugs operate. If it's happening, it sure is happening slowly.
Very slowly. Dr. Gottlieb, can you define the clinical endpoint that the FDA requires in its trials?
Well, a clinical endpoint is an endpoint. The simple way to define it is it's something that can be experienced by a patient. So some kind of measure of clinical improvement that's going to be a benefit that the patient can appreciate. So the ability to breathe better, the reduction in pain, certainly living longer, changes in morbidity and mortality, as opposed to a surrogate endpoint, which is an interim measure that presumably could correlate with a clinical outcome, but isn't something that's perceivable by the patient. It's a marker.
Would you enhance that or enlarge that from your personal experience?
Enhance the use of surrogate measures? Certainly. I mean, FDA, I think, over a period of time made wider use of surrogate measures, particularly in oncology, things like tumor shrinkage. I think the agency's experience with that was mixed insofar as some of the surrogates that they relied on didn't necessarily correlate with clinical benefit when they did the larger studies, and so it left somewhat of an unhappy experience, and the agency became more skeptical using surrogates generally. So I think where I would try to advance this is in trying to create some kind of pathway to better validate these surrogates more quickly. There's a lot of surrogates that make a whole lot of clinical sense. There's good theoretical reasons why they should correlate with a clinical benefit, but FDA is unwilling to rely on them or reluctant to rely on them because nobody's demonstrated that. And it's very hard to demonstrate that until you actually do the very long trial in the context of a drug. And by then, you've sort of, put a drug through an enormous clinical development program.
Do you see any interim type of facility or group that could actually mitigate that?
Well, people always talk about having independent entities like the NIH invest in trials just for the purposes of validating surrogates. I think the FDA has flexibility, has a lot of authorities that it could use to take some risk around the uncertainty that pervades these surrogate measures to allow drug trials to go forward. One of the examples that I cited recently was polycystic kidney disease, where it's a genetic disease you inherit it over the course of a lifetime. You develop cysts in your kidneys, and eventually your kidneys fail. Right. And you go on to end-stage renal disease. The question is, could a reduction in the accumulation of these cysts be a valid surrogate for a clinical trial? FDA has been reluctant to accept cyst reduction or reduction in the propagation of cysts as a valid surrogate in the past, although it makes a whole lot of theoretical sense that if you can reduce the accumulation of these cysts, obviously it's going to prolong the length that your kidneys function. These are the kinds of things I think we need to look for, these opportunities where there are these surrogates that make a whole lot of clinical sense and theoretical sense, and either take the risk of allowing the trials to go forward on the basis of them or find a way to validate them more quickly.
Well, you kind of breach my next question. How important is it for the FDA to use its accumulating experience when conducting clinical trials, as outlined in your written remarks?
Right, and I cite the example of the mucopolysaccharide diseases, where if you look at this is a sort of cluster of related disorders, but they're each treated by distinct drugs, very rare. Some of them you only have hundreds of afflicted patients. If you look at the initial drug that was approved in this broader class, it was approved on the basis of, I think, about a 20-patient, open-label, non-randomized study, probably as least rigorous as you can conceive of. And then there were subsequent approvals for a number of other drugs. And with each approval, the theoretical basis for understanding why a replacement enzyme would work in one of these diseases was more firmly established, yet with each subsequent approval, the clinical trial requirements got harder, not less. And you can't argue that it was a function of the fact that there was available therapy, because there wasn't. Each disease was distinct. So the subsequent therapies were only going to treat one of these diseases. I think those are situations where when the agency has knowledge it's accumulating in a clinical setting like that, it needs to find a way to make wider use of that so that it can lower barriers to entry as it gains more knowledge in an area and not raise them.
Gotcha. Thank you, Chairman.
Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hastings, thank you for appearing here today and offering your testimony. I want to touch on a few points you highlighted where you speak to FDA's regulatory environment has improved in recent years, but you noted that there are additional ways to improve efficiency, timeliness, and consistency of drug evaluations. I'm specifically interested in how the FDA communicates with you and your members. I understand that according to your internal survey, the majority of your member companies believe that communications with FDA, while it has improved, it's really been affected by sequestration, especially recently. Have your members, Mr. Hastings, expressed disappointment that Industry Liaison Office that was anticipated by PDUFA 5 has yet to be fully staffed because of sequestration?
So yes, the Office of Enhanced Communication, I'm paraphrasing it, was an attempt to create an office whereby folks could call in and if there were communications issues. But one of the things I was just sharing with Dr. Woodcock earlier is that the whole intention of the enhanced communication provision we had in PDUFA was for a cultural shift to occur inside the agency such that we actually wouldn't need that office to communicate with our reviewers. What's interestingly happened, and could be a side effect of sequestration, there's only one person in that office that I know of right now versus the 5 or 6 that were going to be there. But some of the communication between reviewers and companies has gotten better. And when you look at the survey, in areas like oncology, which is the area that we're studying, that communication has gotten markedly better. So rather than writing letters back and forth and taking 30 days each time a letter gets written to have the other person have the opportunity to respond, simple phone calls take place. So a cultural shift has been very beneficial. The issue that we have right now is we'd like to take that very positive example and make it extend across all the division and all the reviewers so that each company, no matter what therapeutic area they're in, is benefiting from that same enhanced communication. Now, would that office, the Office of Enhanced Communications, had it been staffed up by without sequestration, would that have helped? It probably would have in some of those other areas. So I think the main beef we have about sequestration, again, is that these are fees that we're paying on top of what we pay in taxes and everything else, and we're paying those fees in order to enable. And think it's like I mentioned, it's a bit like paying your electric bill and then being told you can't have power.
Well, no, the power is there. You're just not allowed to access it.
Right. But I think you know, and we've been working on this for many, many years now, enhanced communications, and we are seeing some good progress. So I don't want to pin this all on, well, it's that one office that's going to solve this issue. It's more a reviewer cultural issue, and I will say for the Office of Oncology, there's an openness to communication. Now, again, what's going to help them communicate more openly with us is that they're effectively staffed, they're effectively funded, so they actually have time to pick up the phone and have a conversation with us.
So I'm just a teeny bit confused. So you said that office that should be staffed up, it should have 4 or 5 people. Right now only has 1 because FDA can't staff it up due to sequestration. But you're saying just that one person is more responsive? Is that?
No.
Or are you saying that you're sort of, because they're not there, you're just talking directly to the reviewer and not going through the office?
What I'm saying is it's great to have that office, and that office is going to be helpful. Right?
Okay.
But the whole concept was to have open communication with reviewers, which are not in that office.
And that's, okay, but that's happening now, and that's improved.
Now, right.
And
So
you're,
the mere fact that we're paying attention to the issue
Okay.
on both sides has made the issue better, right?
right.
And so the fact that it would be great for the office to be staffed, because I think in general, being staffed appropriately is going to help. But equally important as that office are individual reviewers in individual divisions having good communication with sponsor companies.
Are there any fears that if that office staffs up completely, there will be another layer of bureaucracy and that the communications directly with the reviewers will stop because people will feel like they have to go through that office?
No.
No fears of
Absolutely
that?
not. No. I mean,
Okay.
companies don't work that way.
Okay.
You have a relationship with your reviewer, and you have communication with that reviewer. If a hiccup should occur, there are a number of ways one can help to remedy that, including talking to that office about ways to, enhance the communication.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank this very distinguished panel for taking your time and giving us your expertise in this area. I represent an area in which there are a higher degree than normal of businesses associated with bio and technology and others, and have actually tried to work with some of my constituents as we have negotiated the process of dealing with the agencies. And I also worked as a prosecutor acting on behalf of the agencies at certain times. So I've seen it from both sides. But if I was to look from 500 feet, there's just a tremendous frustration with the inability to have people make decisions. And I'm not sure that I understand exactly why that is. And what I see frequently is the process being used as a mechanism to avoid decision-making. And I can appreciate that if a wrong decision is made, there can be implications. But the very process we have is designed to somehow negotiate that fine area. My experience in a number of cases was the concern of clients when I say clients, I mean constituents, who were afraid to be too aggressive in dealing with the FDA for the very fear that what would happen is now they'll be further pushed back in their efforts. And every time a new order is made for a new trial, others, you're implicating potentially millions of dollars and longer periods of time. So why does it take so much time to make decisions? And I'll conclude my questions with what I would find would be these 30-day periods, Mr. Hastings. You're talking about the communications. No communications would take place. There would be substantial amounts of information put together by very qualified people, the best in the business, in the form of making the case. And on the 29th day, they would get another letter asking for more information. So it was almost like every time the clock would reach the moment, something else would be put in the place, the time would toll, and there'd be more requests. Until ultimately you got to a point there was a decision maker, and somebody would say, you know what, you're right. And a few times we broke through. But I'm struggling with this problem. And I want to see both sides. But you're out there too. What do you see? What's the solution? Dr. Gottlieb, your written testimony speaks to, I think what you said was a failure for people to, well, you know the language was the fear of uncertainty pervading. So you understand my questions. Maybe you could each in order respond to my concerns and tell me what you think.
Well, I think generally there's a lack of appreciation for the time cost of capital inside FDA, and it's probably not something you would expect them to be very cognizant of, but there is a significant cost to time when you're running a development program, even more so than getting advice back from the FDA that you have to run a bigger clinical trial. That can be funded and financed if you're a biotech company, but the time itself is a lot of lost capital. And the cycling has always been a problem. The multiple cycles has always been a problem in FDA. There's been, over time, various efforts to try to address multiple cycle reviews, but it's a significant problem. I would argue that the process isn't just used to avoid decisions. I think the process is used to try to tee up easy decisions. You know, from my perspective, the reviewers in the early development stages of a drug program have a lot of autonomy, or a fair measure of autonomy, to prescribe what they think the clinical trial requirements should be to the companies. And when the companies get advice back from their medical reviewer, they're very reluctant to challenge it in many cases. They follow it. And so if you're a medical reviewer and you know you're going to be ultimately responsible for making an approval decision or a decision to reject a drug, what you want is very clear evidence to make that decision. And so if you have discretion, you could prescribe a very rigorous clinical trial that's going to lead you to a place where you're ultimately going to have very clear evidence. But there's a significant cost to that. And so I think the process is used to try to make easier decision-making, and that's what ends up delaying the development programs.
Are we losing? Well, let me ask the other panelists to respond to sort of the sentiments that I expressed. Mr. Huber?
Well, I'd like to try answering from a slightly different perspective. In the 1981 or two, it was that HIV surfaced as AIDS. People hadn't yet identified the virus. It was a real sense of panic. I arrived in Washington right around that time, and there was a palpable sense of, gee, something really terrible is happening once people realized what was going on. You know, in the late 80s, as AZT emerged, and through the 1990s, the FDA was remarkably agile and willing to bend its rules. It carved the accelerated approval rule was spawned during that time. They began doing treatment INDs during that period, basically a parallel track of actually prescribing the drug through hospitals and clinics and so on to make what was available, and there wasn't that much available, broadly available. It's astonishing what was accomplished during that period. A substantial number of drugs to treat the secondary effects of HIV, the AIDS-related disorders, and then a whole series of HIV drugs. We needed a whole bunch because the virus is so nimble, you have to attack it from multiple points to subdue it. And also a number of cancer drugs were also the beneficiaries during that decade. And I think anybody who looks retrospectively at this believes that the medicine was really advancing very well. We accomplished fantastic stuff. There was despite talk of the biases of one side or the other, there was really quite a bipartisan coalition to do this, and we beat what was thought to be and was in fact an extraordinarily difficult virus. It is possible to make decisions fast in this city when people are really sufficiently united and scared. And the President's own, the PCAST report I mentioned earlier, I mean, by all accounts, the accelerated approval process overall, which does what it says, it's a conditional approval, but it does approve drugs much faster, has had I think very few people think it has done anything other than more good than harm, okay? You can move these things quickly if you want to, and you can get, I won't say invariably good results, but many more good results than bad ones.
Thank you. Mr. Hastings?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to first speak to the fear of retribution comment you made earlier. If I was fearful of retribution, I wouldn't be sitting here, I have to say. I think that...
Was it a fair comment? I mean, do you think others may feel that way, or do you feel...
I think it is. I think it is. And I just want to say I think it's a very individual thing. But I do believe that with good dialogue and adults in the room, decisions can get made. And I will tell you that in my experience now, having been doing this for a number of years, I mean, what we need to do in Washington now has become 25% of our jobs as CEOs of biotechnology companies. And that engagement, when you have that engagement and there's good dialogue, good things can come out of that. Now, I'll just give you an example from my company, and I'll juxtapose that to an example from a colleague of mine. One of the benefits of being the chairman of the emerging companies section of the Biotech Industry Organization is I'm with a room full of CEOs as big as this room, every quarter. So we had a situation not too long ago where there was a 30-day period, and on the 30th day we got an answer, and it was yes. We might get an answer, and it could be no. So if the answer is no, invariably they're going to ask for more information if they want you to turn it around to a yes. So, but what we're seeing, what I was seeing recently was that particular case took 30 days. I've had situations where it's happened sooner, okay? But 30 days, I got a yes. Great. Now I have a colleague who didn't get an answer in 30 days in another division. So I think that inconsistency needs to be dealt with. But I also think that part of that inconsistency has to do with the volume of work people have and the proper staffing and the proper funding of the agency. And again, going back to user fees, making sure that user fees are being spent to actually enable the FDA. So I do think there's variability reviewer to reviewer. I think the retribution thing, there are mechanisms now within the FDA that if there is a person who is behaving in a way which is professionally inappropriate, that you can go and get that issue solved. And I don't know how many folks may have mentioned to you the fear of retribution if you'd ask them, what did you do about that? But that's what I often do. And sometimes there are, they're not aware of the mechanism, or they don't partake in the mechanism, and then all of a sudden this becomes a big problem.
I think they often make cost-benefit analyses of the thing.
Could be, yeah, it could be.
Yeah, and they just, I don't want to overstep my time, so I appreciate the time you gave me, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you. And to the panel, let me recognize Mrs. Spear again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank our panelists for participating today under what are difficult circumstances at the end of the year with everything else being equal. I do want to make a point, though, as they have presented. I think that we here in Congress have to take a certain amount of blame for the period of time, and I don't believe it's right now, but the period of time when the FDA started to hold back. Because the first thing that would happen when there was a bad outcome with a drug is that the FDA was hauled up here by us and scrutinized and beaten up and pummeled about their process and how could this have happened. And I think the result was that these FDA representatives would go back and say, all right, then we'll just put the brakes on many of these approvals. So we've got to take some responsibility, I think, for what has happened. I think more recently, and I think it's been testified to today, there has been a loosening of the process within the FDA and strategies employed that show that there are new pathways that are working, maybe not in every area, but certainly in some that show promise. And I guess the silver lining in the sequestration is that if it gets to the point where people actually get on the phone and talk to each other, that's a really good sign. So maybe we can enlist more of that in the future.
And the good news of that comment for me, Mrs. Spear, is that Mr. Meehan and I were not here earlier during that time in Congress, so we can, grateful for your time here. Thank you for what you've contributed both in written form and oral form. We'll continue to tap on your research in the days ahead, both in what's being written and the insight you can bring. So I appreciate you very much. We'll take a short recess to be able to reset the panel and have our second panel.